One of the most infuriating internet trends I've come across while mindlessly doom-scrolling my life away on YouTube Shorts are these videos that try to pit the art of medieval Europe against supposedly medieval Asian art, or art from other cultures as a whole. Like, they'll start off with a slideshow of beautiful portraits or drawings of animals with elegant and very stereotypical Chinese or Middle Eastern or Indian music playing over it, like this. Or this. Or this. And then show a slideshow of the most absurd examples of medieval European marginalia they could find. Like this. Or this. Or this. With the obvious point being, look at how crappy medieval European art is compared to everyone else's art. Now, there are so many things I hate about these. First of all, the cherry-picked art used in the first halves of these shorts are almost always from centuries after the Middle Ages. Like, if you reverse image search this, which only takes like 5 seconds, you'll see that it's a portrait of a guy named Ying Shang, or Prince Yi, who lived from 1686 to 1730. And this is a portrait of the contemporary Mughal Emperor, Bahadur Shah, who ruled his empire from 1707 to 1712. So, way after this art was made. And the trend continues. This beautiful Iranian piece is almost certainly a Qajar dynasty painting from the 18th or 19th centuries. The one that's supposed to represent medieval Turkish art is a modern Iranian piece made by Mirza Aga Amani, who was born in 1881 and died in 1955, though he is noted for working in a traditional Iranian style. This is another Mughal dynasty tempera portrait of a court lady, possibly named Ad Begum, singing and playing an instrument called a veena. It's from around 1760, and it's in the Cleveland Museum of Art of all places. But this one by Historagio has to be the most egregious example. Granted, it doesn't claim to be comparing medieval art, but the thing is, half the portraits of Middle Eastern women he uses aren't even from Middle Eastern artists. But I guess the creator didn't take the 5 seconds it would have taken to go beyond the first 5 results on Google Images. This lithograph is taken from a book entitled Afghanistan by Lieutenant James Rattray, who published it in 1848, and it's of the favorite wife of the governor of Bamiyan, you know where those giant Buddhist statues were, whose name was Shakar La, and she's taking her veil off in a secluded area. And these other ones are from Middle Eastern artists, but they're modern. Though most of the time, the images they use are just 19th century or modern art, or even just AI slop, and that even applies to the animal pictures they use. This dragon definitely seems like AI, and this supposedly ancient Egyptian cat is absolutely just straight up AI. This is how the ancient Egyptians really depicted their cats, and their cat goddesses. They're still beautiful, but I think a bit less cuddly than how we usually portray cats today. I don't think history should be treated like a competition ever, but if you're saying you're comparing medieval art or art from different cultures, just use medieval art or art from different cultures. And it wouldn't even hurt your case, because medieval Asian art is pretty awesome. I really like it. The best paintings from Tang and Song Dynasty China, so i.e. real medieval China, do generally look way more naturalistic than most European art of the time. But then again, there are way better examples of medieval European paintings than these little manuscript illustrations that these shorts use to represent them all. And that's the thing that really grinds my gears. I'm far from being one of those guys who idolizes the Middle Ages and somehow thinks that peasants lived better than people today. But I hate how these videos just offhandedly disparage medieval Europe by cherry-picking the best non-European art they can find, regardless of where or when it's from, while also cherry-picking the simplest European art they can find, to create the illusion that it was childishly crude or even ugly, when that can't be further from the truth. So, I'm going to run through some medieval European art to show you that there is actually a ton of medieval art that does scratch that naturalistic itch, while still maintaining that unique medieval style. And there is a lot that definitely isn't naturalistic, but are still triumphs of human creativity. As such, we're going to do a little whistle-stop tour of all the sorts of amazing art made in medieval Western Europe, because the real point of this video is to provide both myself and you guys a little gateway to pretty cool, lesser-known works of art and artists that might have otherwise slipped you by. Because surprise, surprise, it wasn't just all about botched depictions of elephants or killer snails and rabbits duking it out, as funny as I think they are. And I can't put down manuscripts as a whole because have you seen some of the fancier ones? Like, for example, there are some absolutely incredible illustrated gospel manuscripts from early medieval Ireland and Great Britain, like the Book of Durrow from the 7th century, or the Lindisfarne Gospels from around 700, or the famous Book of Kells made around the year 800, and the depictions of the four evangelists in the early 9th century Ebo Gospels, created in a part of the Carolingian Empire that's now northeastern France, look as ethereal and otherworldly as the works of El Greco or William Blake, and they're made up of the same unique frenzied lines as the illustrations in the slightly later 9th century Utrecht Psalter. And fast forwarding to later in the Middle Ages, there are tons of prayer books called Books of Hours, often with customized portraits of their bigwig owners, that are chock full of insane illustrations, like the so-called Bedford Hours or the Hours of the Duc de Berry, and tons more. Plus, these sorts of detailed illustrations don't just appear in religious works. The illustrators of Jean Froissart's Chronicles of the 100 Years' War, like the Flemish artist Loiset Liedet, provide a real window into how their world looked. I mean, just look at how elaborate all the armor is, and how detailed the buildings and the backgrounds are. And I have to concede that medieval artists definitely didn't always get animals right, but these war horses look pretty spot on to me. The Eastern Romans, or Byzantines, also made some absolutely amazing manuscripts of their own that actually maintain some of the naturalism of antiquity. Like, these are legit Roman soldiers here. And this 10th century manuscript called the Paris Psalter is absolutely breathtaking. Like, this is supposed to be the Pharaoh from the Exodus, and like, that's just a real guy's face. I wish I knew about this sooner. This is awesome. But even though I personally love Byzantine art, we're gonna be sticking to just Western European art, for the sake of brevity and because the stuff from there seems to be the main target of the vitriol against medieval art. But speaking of the Byzantines, they did inspire some insane medieval mosaics in Italy. There's of course the iconic St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, decorated in glittering golden mosaics from different time periods, but largely from the 11th to 13th centuries, and it's crazy how it just brazenly depicts how the Venetians stole the body of St. Mark, which some repute to actually be the body of Alexander the Great, from Alexandria. But there's also the very underrated Church of Santa Prassede in Rome, which is covered in beautiful mosaics from the early 9th century, commissioned by Pope Paschal I, who's depicted with a strange blue square halo to denote that he was still the living pope, so not a saint. Yet. In one beautifully decorated little side chamber named the Chapel of St. Zeno, which contains a pillar that Christ himself was supposedly whipped on, that was brought over later during the Crusades, Pope Paschal depicted his mom, Theodora, standing right next to the saints, which I thought was pretty interesting. Oh, and funnily enough, I only knew to look for this place because of that video I did trying to debunk AI slop, so what comes around goes around, I guess. And I also can't forget all the stunning Byzantine-style mosaics commissioned by the Norman rulers of Sicily, like at Monreal. And then there's medieval sculpture, which I personally really like. The earlier Romanesque pieces might look a bit simple and a bit too idealized sometimes, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, I don't think you can argue that high Gothic sculptures aren't amazing, and often insanely beautiful and tender. Like at Naumburg Cathedral in northeastern Germany, there are some amazing sculptures of some of the cathedral's initial donors that still maintain some of their original pigmentation. The standouts being Regalinda, a Polish princess, and the iconic statue of Uta von Ballenstedt, which might have inspired the look of the evil queen from Snow White. They both lived in the early 11th century, but were sculpted centuries later in the 13th. Another masterpiece of 13th century Gothic art is nearby in Bamberg Cathedral, the Bamberg Rider. No one knows who the Bamberg Rider actually represents, but it's one of the first large-scale equestrian statues sculpted since antiquity. And then in France, you have all the statues of kings decorating Notre Dame Cathedral, many of which were destroyed during the French Revolution. Plus, you just can't forget the incredibly serene angels soaring above Reims Cathedral. And there are some choice examples of the late Romanesque style in Spain, like the extravagant Portico de la Gloria in Santiago de la Compostela, or this at Carrion de los Condes, or this at Santo Domingo de Silos. And then heading up north to England, you have the amazing sculptures of kings decorating the choir screens of Canterbury Cathedral and York Minster. But yet again, Italy has some of the best examples, because you know those Italians, they're good at art. Truthfully, I didn't know about them before researching this, but the 13th to 14th century Father father-son pair of Nicola and Giovanni Pisano should be way more famous, because their works are shockingly naturalistic. The pair of them both worked on the magnificent pulpits of the Pisa Baptistry, just across from its famous leaning tower, as well as the one in Siena Cathedral, which both clearly take a lot of inspiration from ancient Roman art they saw. Giovanni then decorated the exteriors of both buildings with incredible statues, before creating the astonishingly lively sculptures making up the pulpits of Sant'Andrea in Pistoia and Pisa Cathedral. He even got away with adding a naked Hercules to it. Anyways, I dare you to say that 13th century European art is ass after saying this. I dare you. Then later on came Donatello, who dominated sculpture in 15th century Italy, and was of course reincarnated as a crime-fighting turtle. There are too many works of his to count, but I saw his incredibly tender Pazzi Madonna, made around 1420 in Berlin. It inspired a whole bunch of copies, especially because the receding lines of the niche follow linear perspective and converge into a single point, so the figures seem to pop out into the world of the viewer. I also really like the statue of St. George, and the base for it in the Bargello, or Bargello in Florence, and the magnificent equestrian statue of the mercenary Gattamelata in Padua. So medieval artists didn't just always make sculptures of religious figures, and there are actually some surviving monumental sculptures of rulers, like this giant statue of Charles of Anjou in the Capitoline Museums in Rome. This guy loved collecting fiefs and kingdoms. At different points, he was king over Naples, Sicily, and Albania. There's also this other one of a king in the Metropolitan Museum, made somewhere in northern Italy in the 1230s. There are also some amazing late medieval busts of northern Italian nobles, like this one by Antonio Rossellino, and this one by Francesco Laurana, originally from Dalmatia. Both the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse were great at metalwork, especially these neat enameled pieces, but both the prehistoric and the medieval Irish were absolute masters of it. And the appeal of most of their pieces are their insanely elaborate, and I think strangely futuristic looking patterns, interweaving into each other, and sometimes they incorporate really interesting depictions of people. Like there's this very nice 11th or 12th century reliquary box called the Brachmaiog, emblazoned with these awesome depictions of women with really long hair and men with really long hair and beards. I love it. And then there are these weird things called aquamanils, which were used as ewers for carrying water you'd wash your hands with. And you can find these things all over the place. And they come in a variety of forms, like beasts, knights, and even this. The guy's supposed to be Aristotle, by the way. And a masterpiece, or rather set of masterpieces I can't forget, are the giant Bernward doors in Hildesheim Cathedral, which show both the fall of man on the left and the life of Jesus on the right, for symbolism's sake, of course. It was reportedly made by Bishop and later Saint Bernward himself, around 1015, so it's classed as one of his relics. Interestingly, this guy minted his own Roman-style coins, too, which is pretty cool. And just a few steps away in the same cathedral is another metal masterpiece, made just afterwards, around 1020, known as the Bernward Column, which again shows the life of Jesus, but arranged in a helix, in conscious imitation of the sorts of triumphal columns left by Roman emperors. And there are tons of golden reliquaries, often in the shape of busts, like this one of Charlemagne, and you can't forget the famous early Renaissance metalworkers like Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, and that's not even to mention all the armor. Even the coins are stylish. Most of the other coins minted around the world at the time don't have portraits on them. But depending on the value and fanciness of the coin, medieval European coins can feature really interesting miniature portraits of the rulers who commissioned them. And sometimes they're in deliberate imitation of ancient Roman coins, like the famous Augustalis of Frederick II. Medieval artists were also strangely fond of ivory, of course including Greenlandic walrus ivory, like the so-called Wingfield Digby crozier, so like a staff for a bishop, which is in England but originally comes from either Ireland or Norway. And they can make really insanely elaborate tapestries too. Some of the most amazing are the late medieval unicorn tapestries, which show you exactly how to capture a unicorn, and the so-called 9 Heroes tapestries, which show King Arthur alongside ancient Roman figures that are now both hanging in New York. And given the importance of the church, they also embroidered insanely elaborate ecclesiastical vestments, which was actually a specialty of the English. And that brings us to our final section on paintings. Even if they're not all naturalistic, one of the things I most admire about medieval paintings is how oftentimes they completely engulf spaces, so you're almost transported into the world of the painting. The most incredible example I've personally been within has to be the crypt of the Basilica of the old Roman town of Aquileia in northeastern Italy, which is emblazoned with clearly Byzantine-inspired and very emotive frescoes, depicting things like the legend surrounding the life of the town's first bishop, Saint Hermagoras, who was supposedly chosen by Saint Peter himself, which is why the bishops of Aquileia who commissioned this called themselves the Patriarchs of Aquileia, which was a big deal. They even ruled their own big secular state within the HRE at one point. Some other amazing examples also seem to come from Denmark and Sweden and Norway, albeit some definitely do look a bit strange. But let's get to individual painters, and there's no shortage of them. Throw a dart at a map of Europe and it'll wind up somewhere where incredible painters were working. And some of my all-time favorite painters were from the late medieval Low Countries. There's of course Jan van Eyck, active in the first half of the 15th century, who made ornate masterpieces that just sort of suck you in with their detail and mystery, like of course the famous Arnolfini portrait, which is still a constant source of debate and intrigue, and Hieronymus Bosch, who pioneered Surrealism before Surrealism was even a thing. He also pioneered putting sheet music on butt cheeks. But there are tons of lesser-known painters that deserve way more attention. But I'm gonna really have to put on my best Dutch accent for this, so get ready for it.
Dietrich Bouts, Geertgen tot Sint-Jans.
I really like his Nativity at Night, and the figures in his Lamentation of Christ look unbelievably lifelike.
Hans Memling,
Who made some awesome portraits.
Hugo van der Goes.
Who also specialized in insane portraits.
Petrus Christus.
Look at this little fly he added to this monk's portrait to make it seem as if the painted frame is real. Isn't that awesome?
Barthélemy de Eyck.
Possibly a relative of Jan van Eyck, who worked as a manuscript illuminator in France and made amazing use of shadow. He also completed the Très Riches Heures of the Duc de Berry, started by
De Limburg Brothers.
And obviously you can't forget the Italians. There's Duccio, whose work sort of bridges the influence of Byzantine icons and more naturalistic Italian work, active in the 13th and 14th centuries, and his contemporary, Giotto, whose Scrovani Chapel in Padova is just breathtaking, especially the scene depicting the kiss of Judas. Like that is mwah! Literally. And Tommaso de Modena from the mid-14th century, who made one of the earliest depictions of glasses. There's Sassetta from the early 15th century, who made these awesome paintings of St. Francis. Taddeo Gaddi, one of Giotto's students and a master in his own right. Simone Martini, who was clearly influenced by Giotto. Cosimo Tura, who made some insanely elaborate pieces, like this one of a nymph surrounded by gem-studded golden dolphins. Piero del Pollaiuolo, a master of both portraiture and paintings of women growing trees out of their arms, and Andrea del Verrocchio. But that's not all. There's Piero della Francesca, whose art really reminds me of those semi-uncanny mid-20th century paintings from Canadian artist Alex Colville that look like they're computer-generated. And maybe that's because he doubled as a mathematical theorist. Another interesting case is Fra Filippo Lippi, who was a friar until he abducted a nun in 1456, but he made some awesome paintings, and his son, with that nun, Filippino Lippi, also made some great stuff with Botticelli, who you can also sort of count since he was mainly active in the 15th century, but whatever. And the list goes on and on and on. There's Masaccio Masolino de Panical, another pioneer of oil painting, who worked with Masaccio in the 1420s on the beautiful Brancacci Chapel in Florence, but liked adding a bit more decoration to his pieces. Lorenzo Monaco, a monk who may have trained Masolino, and Paolo Uccello, who made this giant painting celebrating Florence winning the Battle of San Romano. It's one of the best contemporary depictions of knights I've ever seen, and you can see how interested in linear perspective he was. Also Domenico Veneziano, who is from Venice but is most famous for the altar of St. Lucy made for Florence, which presents space insanely well. And then if we hop up to Germany, there is of course Lucas Cranach the Elder and Albrecht Dürer, the greatest printmaker of all time. But they both sort of span the 15th and 16th centuries, so they might not count. But I'm going to mention their somewhat lesser-known contemporaries, Ulrich Abt the Elder and Bernhard Strigel, who both also made some insane paintings, including some early glimpses at how bad the Habsburg jaw was about to become. And the 15th century Germans also made some insane paintings on the shields they'd use in jousting tournaments. which reminds me of this beautiful, if somewhat macabre, piece used for parades and now in the British Museum. There are also a bunch from France, but I'll only mention a few, like Jean Fouquet, who made the famous Melun diptych. On the left, you see Saint Stephen, with the guy who commissioned the painting, holding what's probably a Paleolithic hand axe, which the artist must have somehow gotten a hold of, representing how the saint got stoned to death. And on the right, you have this downright bizarre rendition of the Madonna that's probably modeled after the mistress of the King of France, Agnes Sorel, surrounded by all these surreal red and blue angels. There's also Nicolas Froment, who made a bunch of amazing paintings for René of Anjou, King of Naples, like the so-called Burning Bush triptych and the Matheron diptych. See, a triptych has 3 panels and a diptych has 2. And Simon Marmion, famous for the ornate Saint Bertin altarpiece. And on the flip side, these simple but very eerie images of hell from the Visions of Tondal manuscript. The Swiss have Konrad Witz, who was amazing at depicting water, and Hans Fries, or Fries? I don't know. The Spanish deserve some credit too, especially whoever painted the beautiful murals spanning the vaults of the convent of Santa Maria in Sigena, and that was in the late 12th century. And I also found this amazing Hispano-Flemish piece called The Lamentation, made at the tail end of the 15th century. Portugal has Nuno Gonçalves, who's most famous for probably being behind this massive group portrait of the royal court of King Afonso V, including Prince Henry the Navigator, surrounding 2 portraits of Saint Vincent, the patron of Portugal's expansion into North Africa. Austria had Roland Frouf the Elder and his contemporary, Thomas von Villach. And England has the Wilton diptych, made in the 1390s for King Richard II, shown kneeling to the Madonna next to his patron saints, who were mostly other kings. But it might have been made in France. A somewhat more homegrown option is a very early altarpiece called the Westminster Retable from the 1270s, and the awesome illustrations in Thomas Hoccleve's 15th century work, like this depiction of Henry V, or this one of Chaucer. From up in Scotland, there's this unique illuminated manuscript depicting the kingdom's history called, and I kid you not, the Scotic Chronicon, which sort of looks like an indie graphic novel, but in a good way. And unfortunately, there aren't too many surviving paintings from medieval Ireland, except obviously the illuminated manuscripts we went over before, but Cormac's Chapel on the Rock of Cashel has tantalizing fragments of bright Romanesque frescoes from the mid-12th century that once adorned it. It's a real shame that it's mostly fragmentary. And there are also these really unique ones, emblazoning the walls and ceilings of the Clare Island Abbey in Mayo. But to conclude, I think this rather scuffed dog is a pretty good metaphor for all this. Because if you zoom out to look at the larger painting it's a part of, you'll see these amazingly rendered and very expressive, if not slightly exaggerated, people, themselves part of a much larger altarpiece, now in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Dijon. You know, the mustard place. This was painted by a group of anonymous Swiss artists active at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century, so at the very tail end of the Middle Ages, called the Masters of the Carnation, because at the bottom of all of their paintings, they left signatures in the form of a carnation crossed with a sprig of lavender, and no one knows why. Here it's painted right next to the dog. So if that had some unknown symbolic meaning, it's possible that even the dog's ugliness has a hidden, deeper moral meaning to it too, possibly representing the weakness of Pontius Pilate in letting Christ get crucified even though he knew he was innocent. But as we've seen, there are numerous pieces that predate this in all sorts of media, which clearly show that medieval artists were capable of making beautifully naturalistic art. But ultimately, just trying to perfectly imitate reality doesn't have to be the point of art, and it clearly wasn't the point to these people. A lot of medieval art plainly isn't naturalistic, but that isn't a bad thing, and I still like looking at them. They're bright and expressive and endearingly folksy, and sometimes pretty funny. But most of all, they put the world through their own unique human lens, and getting to see it is basically the closest thing we have to time travel, so I think it's pretty cool. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know this is a little bit unusual, but I felt compelled to make it. And I swear I didn't plagiarize Noble Villain's new video on medieval art. I was already well into working on this when it happened to come out, which was a pleasant surprise since it's a really good video. And I really encourage you to check it out and subscribe to his new channel, because it looks like it has a lot of potential. But regardless, it's time to thank my lovely patrons, Drew Singal, Bajan, Harrison Timperley, Kevin Ryan, Danny Banani, Little Bluebird, James Kirk, Booga420, Alyssa P, Mark Elliott Cullen, Jack Lester, Mithridates, James414, Inbred Cat, Akune, Mark Krupnik, Michael, Daisies for Ghosts, Prince of Men, Julie Lau, Bean Burrito, Albert Vaclav Smeshkal, The Spoofer, Emily Cujo, Stevan, Greifenfrost, Hippolyta, Magna de Broiker, Julia Erickson, JP Van Splendor. Thank you for voicing all those Dutch names. Surprise, surprise, I know you thought it was me, didn't you? Ryan Gregg, Glubberbob 20 Trillion, Mason, Bread, Brandon Wood, Giovanna Lazzarini, Patrick Darius Gromodka, Artem, Chris J, Max S, The History Enjoyer, Daniel Battery Stapler, Menda Pruska, Lazy Ram, Bad at Aiming, Weston Van Diver, Board Lord, It's Premium, Yog, Jane Geeky, Ice, Kate Dalgleish, Lori Weeks, Brett O, CJ Carrera, Trico, Kevin Chachowski, Alco, Nigel, Freddy Fazbear, Artil, Aspergirl, Dr. Kickass, Brandon Thint, DJ Panda Bear, Nonprofit Prophet, Rebecca Baker, Bone Gut, Rainey Porterfield, Toby, Eggworld 3D, Melody Ray, Emerson Fitz, Chandler Sealock, Brady H, and now for the first time ever, Bray Bray. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching. I know I said the next video would be the second part of the oldest country's iceberg, and that's probably going to be next, but I've learned that despite my own planning, my schedule can be a little erratic. Whatever it is, see you next time.